Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope that all of you are doing well, that they're safe and healthy, and happily the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel begins to appear. So the current quarantines and restrictions will likely start to be removed or relaxed in the next few days or weeks. So the economic calamity that we were facing just a week or two ago may not be as dire as we thought if the plans that are currently circulated about relatively speedy reopening of our economy pan out. Okay, so the topic that we have for our discussion today is a very pertinent one: international trade. Why international trade is important, how international trade is conducted, what are theoretical foundations for the theory of international trade, and what are benefits of free international trade for the nations that engage in it. In addition, we are gonna discuss trade protectionism or restrictionism. What are the arguments for and against restrictions of international trade? And finally, how all of this fits into the wider macroeconomic discussions that we had thus far. So this is slightly different. It's a topic that does not directly belong to the core of macroeconomic theorizing, having to do with fiscal, monetary policy, business cycle, economic growth, but indirectly it is related. We will see in a moment exactly how. So let's start first with the kind of general introduction about international trade theory. Before that, I just want to tell you one thing that you might have noticed thus far or not. At any rate, that there is a significant discrepancy between how economists see free trade and how the general public sees international trade. The general public is much less likely to accept the arguments for free trade and far more likely to accept protectionism than the economists. And one of the purposes of this lecture is to give you some reasons for this, to give you some explanations of why economists believe that free trade is a good thing and protectionism a bad thing, whereas the general public thinks pretty much the other way around. So we will see that there are reasons for that having to do both with political economy on the one hand, or psychology on the other hand, and also theoretical principles of economics. The main reason why free trade is let's start from an economic side, from economists. So you heard probably, or I mentioned it at least once or twice, that economists disagree about many things. There isn't even this joking or almost semi-joking statement that if you have two economists and you ask them about anything, they will have three opinions about any given topic. So that's largely and generally true, but there are some exceptions to this. There are some issues in which economists almost universally agree, and this is one of the issues on which pretty much across the ideological spectrum, from Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek on the right, the most extreme free market economists, to Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz on the left side of the spectrum, pretty much agree that free international trade is a good thing. So one of the purposes of this lecture will be to see what made these guys who bitterly disagree about pretty much anything else, what made them agree about free trade, about the benefits of free trade, and about the harmfulness and damage that protectionism brings about. So the economic modeling and economic theoretical reasons for that. So that's about economists. Then why general public doesn't share enthusiasm for free trade that economists have? There are two types of reasons. One reason is that general public is not well acquainted with the theoretical explanations about the benefits of free trade, but even more so, the um, general public has common sense, and common sense is not always a reliable guide in understanding complex phenomena that depend on many moving parts and that depend on complicated arguments. Common sense, in other words, what you think you know and what you think you can see and observe directly may not be a reliable guide in understanding the phenomenon that you are observing and watching. So some things that you might consider to be self-evident or self-evidently true might not be. So when you look at them in a more thorough and strict theoretical fashion, when you analyze them more carefully. So one of the reasons for this is that benefits of free trade are long-term benefits that are not visible directly and observable directly at any one given point in time. So these are the benefits that accrue very gradually over time. So it's difficult to perceive empirically benefits of free trade in 1 month or 2 months or 6 months even. Longer the time horizon, greater the benefits of free trade. So people have this psychological bias that we tend to give a much higher ponder to something that we can observe quickly and in a short term. That's something that is a very small increment over a long period of time. So we got accustomed to it. We got used to it. Like a gradual, small improvements over time. We tend to take that for granted, and that's a kind of improvements and benefits that free trade brings about. Small, gradual, long-term benefits. Whereas we tend to overestimate the significance of anything that is sudden or quicker, either a good thing or a bad thing. We tend to overestimate that. And it happens just that the benefits of protectionism are much more visible and they're much more observable in the short run. For example, if you impose a steel or aluminum tariffs, the beneficiaries of protectionism are people who are going to get higher wages and higher employment in a relatively brief period of time. You can see statistics, you can see people who get employed in steel companies protected by tariffs, you can see the profit rates of the steel and aluminum companies going up. So the beneficiaries of protectionist measures are identifiable and observable directly, and the benefits of free trade are observable much quicker and much sooner than the benefits of free trade. So then it's understandable that the general public that is not very well schooled in economic theory might overestimate the benefits of protectionism and consequently underestimate the benefits of free trade. So short-term versus long-term. The second type of reasons why general public tends to underestimate the benefits of free trade or even to reject free trade outright and accept protectionism is that the beneficiaries are relatively narrow groups. You can identify, sometimes even personally, people who benefit from the protectionist measures. And these benefits are larger. So not only that the benefits are discoverable in a shorter time period, which makes people more amenable to believing that they are real, but also the beneficiaries of protectionist measures achieve substantial gains, substantial increases in their wage rates, substantial increase in investment in the short run. So it's easier to see the benefits. People tend to believe that the benefits are real if people who get the benefits get significant benefits. On the other hand, the nature of benefits that the free trade gets are small incremental benefits to large groups of people. So see, free trade has a pattern of slow improvement and slow gradual benefits to everybody. Whereas protectionism brings about quicker change and quicker benefits to some isolated groups and concentrated benefits, which means benefits to only one isolated group of people while making everybody else pay the costs in the long run. So this is one of the reasons. So this is quite understandable psychological reasons why many laymen and many even intellectuals who are not well versed in economic theory may believe that protectionism is a useful policy, and even politicians, of course. So imagine if you're a politician, it's much easier for you to market the benefits of a policy that benefits somebody that could be that could be captured by the media. You can show up on CNN and say, "Oh, thank you for thanks for our government who imposed the steel tariffs on Chinese steel. Now we can employ more people. I would have lost my job had it not been for our glorious government and their tariffs on Chinese steel." So you can identify these people and beneficiaries, and you can profit politically from doing something to benefit them. So it's a good political proposition. Protectionism is a much better policy, for electorally much better policy than free trade. Why? Because who are beneficiaries of free trade? Millions of people who are going to benefit long time after you leave office. 1 or 2% decrease in prices over 6 months or 1 year, that's relatively modest, long-term and dispersed benefits. It's not so telegenic. It's not so. It makes it for a much worse television than protectionism. So that's the one sinister here correlation or mutual self-enforcement, or let's say amplification, feedback loop, if you want, between general public and politicians, that the general public perceives and praises and accepts benefits for isolated groups, and politicians understand that this is the way how the public sees things and then offers them those kinds of policies that are good for television but that are bad for the economy. Okay. So international free trade. So this is a preliminary explanation for you for this seemingly strange phenomenon that economists, 95% of economists, if you call them, say free trade is good, whereas the general public, majority or general public, with some variation, rejects free trade. What are now theoretical reasons for economists to believe that free trade is good? That's called international trade theory. The cornerstone of international trade theory is the principle known as comparative advantage. That's a theoretical principle that we already encountered. I will just briefly summarize it for you. So comparative advantage is a principle that determines the pattern of specialization. So we know that we are more productive if we specialize in producing one item and exchanging our surplus with somebody else who is specializing in producing something else. So specialization or division of labor is economically productive. Every one of us is better off by specializing in making one thing, one product, one good or service, or a couple of goods and services, and buying on the market everything else produced and sold to us by other people specializing in other things. So that's the principle of division of labor at the cornerstone of is a cornerstone of international trade theory, and comparative advantage is a principle that determines who is going or who should specialize in what. So the country or a firm or an individual who has a comparative advantage in producing one thing should specialize in produce, devote 100% of her time and resources to producing that thing, for example, shoes or computers or wheat, and other people who have a comparative advantage in making other things, they should specialize in making that thing. So comparative advantage is a principle that determines who should specialize in what. So what is comparative advantage? I'm now reminding you of one thing that you should have learned beforehand in the first part of the semester. So I told you that the final exam will be just, in general, just the stuff from after the midterm. But this is one of the things that you have to know that we learned in the first part. That is the principle of comparative advantage. So what is the comparative advantage? You have some numerical examples here. Comparative advantage is I'll explain the graphs in a second, just to give you first the basic introduction, the basic concept. What is the basic concept? Comparative advantage means that you can produce, that you can make something at a lower opportunity cost than somebody else. So that's a definition. A person or a country or an economic unit of any kind or size has a comparative advantage over competing or another economic unit in producing something if that person can make that particular product at a lower opportunity cost than the other person or unit. What does that mean? That doesn't mean that this person is just more efficient, that she's better in doing a thing X than somebody else. It means that that person can perform a service or produce a good by wasting fewer other resources that society also needs. So my favorite example here kicks in this Jeff Bezos janitor example, which you have two economic agents, Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, and a janitor who applies for a job swiping floors at the Amazon headquarters. And now imagine that Jeff Bezos is a better janitor than any one of people who apply for the job. He has absolute advantages, we say. So he is 2 times more efficient in swiping floors than the best candidate that he got, the best applicant that he got. Now the question is, should Jeff Bezos employ any one of the janitors who applied for the job? After all, he's better than any one of them. Why would he employ anyone to do the job when he himself can do it better than them? And now the answer to this is yes, of course, that he needs to employ some of them. Why? Because the opportunity cost of Jeff Bezos doing the janitor's job is much higher than the opportunity cost of janitor doing the janitor's job. That means that the value, economic value that the society loses by Jeff Bezos working 2 hours per day as a janitor is far greater than the economic value society loses by janitor working 2 hours, or even 4 hours, or even 8 hours per day as a janitor. Because the opportunity cost, the value lost, the value forgone for society is whatever Jeff Bezos could have created elsewhere. For example, as a CEO, 2 hours for work as a janitor means 2 hours less in managing the multi-billion world company, the number 1 company in the world, according to market capitalization. I think it's the wealthiest guy in the world. So it would have been a tremendous loss of value for society if Jeff Bezos would have to work as a janitor in his own company. So then the consequence of this is paradoxically that the janitor has a comparative advantage over Jeff Bezos as working in a in the Amazon company, in the Amazon corporation as a janitor. Although he is less efficient in absolute terms than Jeff Bezos, he has a comparative advantage because he is wasting less resources than Jeff Bezos by working that job. So what society loses is some other job that the janitor could have performed had he not been employed by Jeff Bezos. And that other job was probably less economically valuable because otherwise he wouldn't have applied for the janitor's work in Amazon Corporation. Whereas the lost value of Jeff Bezos doing the job will be orders of magnitude higher. So on this image, so now you can replace Jeff Bezos, substitute for Jeff Bezos and janitor, two countries, a wealthy country and poor country, United States or China, for example. And then you can see the same pattern of specialization. So the optimal situation is that Jeff Bezos should work 100% in managing the company, and the janitor should work 100% as a janitor. Both of them would have been worse off if they tried to divide up the tasks between them. If Jeff Bezos were to give 50% of labor time to janitor to work as a manager of corporation, he would have screwed up that. So the total value for both of them will be lower if they divide up equally, if both of them try to run their own Amazon corporation. See, they can cooperate together much more beneficially for both of them, as compared to the situation in which every one of them would try to achieve the same results without cooperation. Okay, so you see that's one of the reasons why this principle of comparative advantage is called the law of association. The law of association. It's better to cooperate in the division of labor and to specialize. You can produce together more things and then exchange them and be better off than if you don't cooperate. So Jeff Bezos is better off. He's got 2 hours of his time to work as a manager for a fraction of value that he creates that way, and the janitor gets a better salary and better wage that he could have acquired on the market otherwise for the same work that he would have performed. So it's beneficial for both of them. So it doesn't matter that Jeff Bezos is better in doing both things. So if their productivities are different, that doesn't mean that the more productive person doesn't need cooperation of the less productive person. She needs it. So the same, just substitute America and China for Jeff Bezos and janitor, and you will get the same. You will get the same system. You will get the same conclusion. So here you have two goods that are being produced on the graphs down here on this exhibit 1. You have America production possibilities frontier. You know what is that? One of the things that you will also have to know. Food and clothing. If America produces everything that it needs, this is the production possibilities frontier, combination of goods that America with 100% use of its resources can produce without trade, without exchange. And this is production possibilities curve for China, Japan in this case, but let's call it China in order to make it more intuitive. So you see, if America works full time to produce only food and no clothing, can produce 90 units of food. How much China can produce? 15 units of food. So America is much more productive than China in making food. Does that mean that America should specialize in making food? We don't know yet, until we see relative productivities in making clothing. So we assume that both countries need both food and clothing. How about clothing? If America works 100%, if uses 100% of its resources to produce only clothing and zero food, it can produce 3 units of clothing. How much China can produce? 15 units of clothing. Okay, so now it seems that America is better in doing both things. Does that mean that America would be better off by producing everything? Because after all, it's better than China. America is more efficient than China is in making everything. No, it's not. Why it's not? Because the production differential, how much America is more productive, is less when it comes to clothing. Just like Jeff Bezos and janitor. Jeff Bezos is 2 times more productive than the janitor in swiping floors, but 200,000 times more productive as a CEO. It doesn't require a genius to understand that Jeff Bezos should forget about swiping floors and pay salary to janitor to do the job. So the same applies here. Yes, America is better 2 times than China. It can produce 3 units if it works 100%. China can produce 15 units. So 2 times better. But look, the relationship when it comes to food. It's, what is it, 5 times? 6 times, yeah. 6 times. So you have a 6-to-1 when it comes to food and 2-to-1 when it comes to clothing. So that means that China has a comparative advantage, although America has an absolute advantage in making both food and clothing. China has a comparative advantage in making clothing because it can make a piece of clothing at a lower opportunity cost by sacrificing less food. It can make 15 units of cloth by sacrificing less food than America. How many? So if you imagine for now the economy in which are both China and America, how many units of food China will sacrifice if it produces 15 units of clothing, 15 units of food? Okay, it can produce 0 now. The maximum production possibility is 15 units of food if it works 100%. If China produces all 15 units of clothing, it can produce 0 units of food. So the loss for Chinese economy or for the total America plus China economy is 15 units of food. That's how much their joint economy will lose by China making clothing. How much total America plus China economy will lose if America produces 15 units of clothing? It's half of 90 units of food is 45 units. It's 3 times as much. Okay, so then the China can produce 15 units of clothing or any number of clothing at a much lower, 3 times lower opportunity cost, 3 times lower sacrifice of food than America. So that means that the China should be producing clothing and working 100% to produce clothing, and America should be working 100% of the time to produce food. So the result will be then, what the result will be? The result will be that consumption increases if China and America specialize and then exchange their surpluses that way. The total consumption of both countries will be greater than the level of consumption allowed by their production possibilities frontier. So what is the total amount of consumption that each country can have if they do not engage in specialization with each other will be somewhere along the production possibilities curve. So they will have to sacrifice some clothing in order to make some more food, or if they want to make some more clothing, they will have to sacrifice some more food. But the production possibilities frontier is a curve that connects all possible combinations of goods, of these two goods that could have been produced at the given level of economic and technological productivity of a given country. So you remember that analysis that you cannot be the combination of goods that you have at your disposal cannot be to the left of the production possibilities curve, and if it's to the cannot be on the right, to the right of the curve, and if it's to the left of the curve, then you are not using your resources efficiently. So if you use 100% efficiently your resources, your consumption level is constrained by your production possibilities frontier for both countries. And now, what is the consequence of specialization? The consequence of specialization is that you can, by specializing in making just one thing that you have a competitive advantage in, and exchanging your surpluses with other country, you can acquire more of both goods eventually. So your consumption could be greater than the level of your production. So that's the. So you don't have to. We don't want to complicate with all these calculations. You can take a look at it later on how this exchange can take place. But the key point here is that specialization in trade allow countries to consume more than they produce. By exchange, countries can afford a higher level of consumption of both goods that they themselves produce. Both countries. So this is one of the key reasons that a country that international trade allows countries to expand their consumption levels beyond their production possibilities frontier. So international trade is productive. It's not only production that increases our possibility, our domestic production is not the only way for us to increase our consumption. Importing cheap foreign goods could be another way. So here, for example, Americans, you can substitute food for high-tech industry. That's much more intuitive. We can produce much more high-tech, and then we have much more high-tech products that we need, and we can exchange some of them with the Chinese, who have a lot of clothing, much more than they need, actually. So they can exchange with us some of their clothing, so then we will have a great amount of both goods, much more of both goods than we would have otherwise in the absence of international trade. Okay. So how comparative advantages are discovered? This looks like a form of central planning that we know this Americans can make something cheaper or Chinese can make something cheaper. It sounded almost as if I knew, or some smart economist or central planner or a government official could have known these cost differentials, who can make something at lower opportunity cost. Actually, it doesn't work that way. It works incrementally and gradually, and individual firms and households discover these data over time. So the costs are not given in advance, they have to be discovered. And who is more efficient in making what is discovered through this gradual market process in which firms experiment and try doing different things in different ways, and then the profit and loss determines who can do what. Chinese are good in making plastic toys and cheap clothes, not because they have smart central planners who decided, comrades, we need to produce this, but rather because the firms that tried producing that in China succeed and grow. They get profit, and profit allows them to reinvest and grow and employ more people, and it's just like a Darwinian selection. The successful firms survive, unsuccessful firms fail. If you try and set up a firm in America that makes cheap clothing, you're likely going to fail because American labor is much more expensive, and the clothing industry is heavily reliant on labor, so you're not likely to succeed in America. Not because the American statistical office or Department of Labor discovered that we cannot do that, but rather because the firms that try to do that are much more likely to fail than to succeed. And then the final result is that the Chinese will be specializing in making clothes, and Americans will be specializing in research and development and high-end manufacturing, precise electronics and stuff like that. So the beauty of the system is that nobody knows these things in advance, but people, firms and individuals experimenting and setting up new companies and growing the existing companies create the pattern of specialization that we then see emerging in reality. And then the exchange is taking place between the countries that specialize in that way. So international trade theory is essentially this claim that specialization is good because it allows countries to profit by trading surpluses of goods they produce for the surpluses of other goods that other countries produce. So see, the basic argument, the basic theoretical case for free trade is based on the idea that there is nothing particularly special about free trade. The free trade, the argument for free trade is just an extension of the most basic principle of division of labor and specialization that pretty much every economist accepts. Every one of us accepts that you cannot choose, that it's not very likely that you as an individual are going to succeed in life by trying to work as a doctor, mechanical engineer, shoemaker, and farmer in the same time. Nobody in their right mind would believe any such nonsense. What does that mean further is that specialization is productive, that everybody should be specializing. What theory of international trade essentially says is just apply this to countries. Just extend the scope of your analysis, and instead of you, yourself, and your family, and your friends, apply this to millions of people all around the world. So, international free trade is a more extended and more productive system of international division of labor. Instead of only Americans specializing and dividing labor, you have now a much larger market. You have now 6 billion people who can specialize in producing different things. And now you can produce much more things in much greater quantities when you have a larger market. So if we in Bismarck, North Dakota, were to produce everything that we need. So first we could have produced, and we have no trade with anyone else in North Dakota, in America, or in the world. Like 100,000 of us in Burleigh County, an independent state, closed trading state, Burleigh County. What we could produce? Some soybeans maybe, but we couldn't produce mechanical agricultural machinery that we need. We need supply chains that involve many other states and many other countries as well. There's very few things that you can, let alone wine and bananas and oranges and fish. So it would have been a tremendous loss of economic wealth if we were to restrict our consumption possibilities to consume to only things that we personally can produce here in our county. That's why division of labor is productive. Then when we expand it to the United States, now it's much better. But it's still not very good. Imagine if we completely close the American market for everybody else, we would have been much poorer than we are in this way. In the same sense, we would have been an order of magnitude or orders of magnitude poorer if we were to produce everything that we want to consume in Burleigh County. So there is no difference. So the theory of international trade says that there is no difference between you and me individually and Burleigh County and the United States. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever for me to impose tariffs on you in our exchanges. Or Burley County. Imagine if Burley County were to impose tariffs on Kansas wheat or corn. Nobody in their right mind in America would say that that makes any economic sense whatsoever for North Dakota. So the theory of international trade says, by the same token, it doesn't make any sense to try and restrict American trade with other countries. Now, as it happens, politically, politicians impose very often restrictions to other countries, whereas they don't impose them internally. But from a standpoint of economic theory, there is no difference whatsoever between somebody prohibiting us in Burley County from economically cooperating with some county in South Dakota and prohibiting or restricting trade between Americans and Chinese or Americans and Europeans. So this is the deepest reason why economists are so skeptical about protectionism, because it's so obviously false when you look at the basic principles of economic theory: division of labor, specialization, and comparative advantage. Okay, now let's analyze what happens more in detail. What are the effects of trade restrictions? There are two types of effects. So trade restrictions, irrespective of what kind of trade restrictions we're talking about, tariffs or quotas or product content regulations, it doesn't matter. There are different kinds of restrictions. All of them have the same effects. There are two kinds of effects of trade restrictions, two kinds of damages that they create. First is distributional effect of protectionism. That means that protectionist measures, let's say tariffs, that are taxes on foreign imports. The first distributional effect is something that you probably heard about. It's a redistribution of income from consumers to producers. So when you impose a tariff, who is losing? Consumers are losing because they have to pay higher prices for both domestic and foreign goods. So higher tariffs means that the foreign companies have to charge higher prices in order to sell in the American market, because they have this additional cost, which is 10% tariff or 15% tariff. So this then allows domestic firms to bid up to increase their prices by the same amount. So then the consumer has to pay higher prices no matter whether she's buying from a domestic or a foreign source. So that's a distributional effect. But there is a second effect, which is the welfare effect. This is called the deadweight loss effect, which means that society as a whole loses part of economic gains of trade when protectionism is imposed. So not only that wealth is redistributed from consumers to producers, so protectionism essentially is a system of exploitation of consumers by domestic firms and producers, but also the total value of goods that is being created in a protectionist system is less than in a free trade system. So in order to understand why is this the case, we have to first define some technical concepts in order to measure, in order to show you that this is indeed the case, that in protectionism producers exploit consumers and the total amount of value created for society is less than under free trade. We have to understand first two theoretical concepts: consumer and producer surplus. These are two concepts that you have to understand. And consumer surplus, that's the basic definition. Consumer surplus and producer surplus are measures of how much producers and consumers gain from trade. Measure gains from trade by consumers or buyers are producers and sellers. So what is a consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is a difference between the maximum buying price that consumer is ready to pay for a product and the actual market price that she pays. So this is shown on this graph here, Exhibit 3, graph A. So you have a supply of good and you have demand. The equilibrium price is $5 and quantity sold is 100. So at price of $5, only people whose maximum buying price that are ready to pay for the same product are higher than $5 are going to buy the product. If your maximum buying price that you're willing to pay is $4, you're not going to pay $5 for something that is worth to you subjectively $4. That doesn't make any sense. You are outside of the market. This entire part of the demand curve down here is outside the market. They don't participate in exchange because the existing market price is too high for them. However, people who are ready to pay this entire part of the demand curve up here are people who are ready to pay different amounts of money for different quantities of this good, and all of them are ready to pay more than $5. So what is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is a difference between your maximum buying price, let's say $6, that's the maximum that you're ready to pay for some good, and the actual price that you pay, $5. So then your consumer surplus is $1. So this triangle here measures the consumer gains, consumer surplus from buying a certain good at $5. It's a quantity of goods, how many units are bought, plus gains because of the difference in your reservation price or maximum buying price and the actual market price. So this gray triangle is a measure of how much consumers gain from exchange. Producer surplus, on the other hand, is a difference between the actual market price, the same price here on $5, and the minimum selling price at which producers are ready to sell. So buyers want to buy at as low a price as possible, sellers want to sell at as high a price as possible. So this part of the supply market above the equilibrium level, they are not in the market because their minimum selling prices are higher than $5. If the price is $5, they're not going to sell because they cannot cover their costs. Only firms and individuals who can produce a good at less than $5 costs, they can afford to sell. So if your costs are $4, your minimum selling price has to be $4 or 4.1, whatever. Okay, so then only firms who are really efficient and individuals who, with a very low costs here, could afford to sell on the market. So the exchange on the market is always between people who value very highly the product, have a strong preference for the product, on the one hand, gray triangle, and people who can produce and offer this product at very cheap prices, suppliers who can afford to offer it at cheap prices. So this yellow triangle is a producer surplus, how much producers gain in terms of trading with consumers. That's the measure of their gains from trade. Okay, so these are the technical concepts. Tariffs and quotas, so tax on import. Quota is a legal limit on the amount of goods. So these are the technicalities. We are different ways in which protectionism could be imposed. We are assuming now that the tariff is imposed. And now this is interesting. This image here shows you exactly on one example why protectionism has both of these effects. On the one hand, an effect of redistributing income from consumers to producers. So it's a plunder of consumer by producer. And on the other hand, it's like a shrinking the pie, reducing the amount of wealth for the society as a whole, irrespective of who is going to capture the benefits of exchange. So now here you see an example of what's going to happen, effects, illustration of what I just told you, on the example of an imposed tariff, let's say steel tariff. So the first image here, I hope that you can see this. Now it's a slightly smaller graph than ideally, but hopefully that you can follow what I'm talking about here. So a picture depicts the price of steel on the world market what would be the price of steel on the world market. If the world market is free, there are no tariffs, then the price will be the intersection of the world supply and world demand for steel. So that's the picture A. Picture B is domestic market. What happens on the domestic market in America? So you see the world market price is the same as it is PW. That's the price level of steel on the world market. But we have now domestic market, and domestic conditions of supply and demand might be different than on the world market. And here you have supply curve in the United States, supply curve for steel, how much steel domestic firms would produce at any given price, and domestic demand curve. Now, if we imagine that America is completely closed off for foreign trade, then the quantity of domestic steel that would have been produced will be the intersection of domestic supply curve and domestic demand curve. So that would be a much higher price here, and quantity somewhere in the middle here, down the horizontal projection of this intersection down here. On the horizontal axis is quantity of cars or quantity of steel. It doesn't matter. On the vertical axis is the price. But let's now assume that we are not talking about isolated state, domestic American production, that we are talking about free trade situation in which there is zero tariffs. It's a free trade case. What would be the world price? What would be the domestic American price if there is a free trade? So you can guess that would be the world price. American firms cannot dictate, because in America it's free to sell steel or cars, and if there are no tariffs, the foreign producers would then ship just the world price plus transportation costs. So it's very likely that in America then steel would be sold at the world price, which is, as you can see, much lower than the domestic price in the absence of any trade with foreign countries. Okay, so now what are the consequences of this? What is the situation of the domestic American market if we have complete free trade? So we have a quantity of domestically produced steel is this point Q1 here, because that's when the price line intersects with the domestic supply curve. Only those producers who can produce at a lower cost than the world price, they can afford to produce and sell on the American market. So then the number 7 triangle will be the producer surplus of American firms, steel producing firms in the free trade case. And Q1 will be the equilibrium quantity of domestically produced steel if there is a free trade. Okay. So now what about demand? When you project the price line to the demand curve, you see what is the quantity demanded for steel in America is Q2. This is a very huge difference here. Much more steel is needed in America than American domestic firms can produce at a given low price. So what happens if trade is free? Q2 minus Q1 quantity, this entire quantity between these 2 points will be imported. So this is American imports, is Q2 minus Q1, is the import that America has if there is a free trade. Okay, so triangle 7 is a producer surplus. What is consumer surplus? That would be this huge triangle from the price line up here. So 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6. This entire huge triangle would be consumer surplus. Because this is the world price, all people who are ready to pay more than the world price will be on the market, they will be buying, and people whose reservation price or the maximum buying price is lower than the world price, they would be outside of the market. So this entire huge triangle here would be consumer surplus. Okay, So now imagine that the government imposes a tariff on foreign steel. And tariff is an additional sum of money that they have to pay. So now what's going to happen? The price is going to increase. And this dotted line here, world price plus tariff, that's the new price of steel on the American market after the tariff has been imposed. So now what happened here, you see, is that first thing that happened is that the domestically produced quantity of steel will increase from quantity 1 to quantity 3. Okay? Because now price is higher, and some of the firms between this point and that point that could not have afforded to produce before now enter the market. So quantity of domestically produced steel goes up from Q1 to Q3, and consequently the producer surplus goes from just this small gray triangle 7 to 7 plus 3, this slightly larger triangle. That's now the new producer surplus. So you see, one part of what used to be consumer surplus, the old consumer surplus, now moves to producer surplus. So that's your distributional effect. Part of the gains that accrued to consumers now belong to producers. What is the new consumer surplus? This is the new price level. So now the triangle depicting consumer surplus has shrunk. It's only 1 plus 2. Whereas this trapezoid here is loss to the consumer. Consumers lost that. Consumer lost that, and part of this loss is captured by producers. This trapezoid 3 is an increment in producer surplus as a result of a higher price that reduced the consumer surplus to the American buyers of steel or car. So you already see that the distributional effect has been proven. This redistributional effect from consumers to producers, you can see graphically that happens. But now there is this additional part of the lost consumer surplus. Let us see how it has been further redistributed. So not all losses that consumers incurred were transferred to producers. Part of it was transferred to the government. This rectangle 5 is the value of the tariff revenue that the government achieves. So supply will increase from Q1 to Q3, and domestic demand will decrease from quantity 2 to quantity 4. You see, because now higher price, people will demand less. When something is more expensive, people will buy less of it. Okay, so now you see this rectangle 5 is the quantity of imports will fall from quantity 2 minus quantity 1 before to quantity 4 minus quantity 3. This middle part, that's the quantity of imports. So imports will shrink as you increase tariffs, as expected. Partially because domestic firms will produce less, partially because domestic buyers will produce more, domestic firms will produce more, partially because domestic buyers will buy less. So this figure number 5 is the total quantity, new, smaller quantity of imports times tariff. So that's the tariff revenue. So you see, protectionism is a system in which producers and government gang up on consumers to plunder it. So part of the gains that consumers derive from buying cheaper foreign goods are now transferred to producers who can charge higher prices and rip off the domestic consumer. A part of it was transferred to the government that has now new tax revenue that it didn't have before. But notice triangles number 4 and number 6. That's a part of previous larger consumer surplus under free trade that nobody captures now. That's the value of gains that simply disappeared. just as if when you slice up pie in 6 or 7 slices, not only that you distribute differently, you don't have it all for yourself, you have to divide it, to share it with your family or friends. So now there is less for you. Imagine that you are in the role of consumer here, but part of the pie crumbles in the process. You lose some part of the pie in this process. So this will be the triangles 4 or 6. That's the value that has been lost for society as a whole. The value or the part of consumer surplus that existed before that nobody captures, neither governments in their tax revenue nor the producers in their higher profit rates and revenue. So this is the second effect. Then not only that protectionism harms consumers, it harms consumers in such a way as to reduce the gains for everybody else, increases the gains for producers and government, but part of the previously existing economic gains will disappear totally from society. So the total level of productivity and total level of economic wealth in society will decline. And this loss is called the deadweight loss. This uncaptured previous benefits for consumers as a consequence of trade protectionism. So this is the deep reason why economists do not believe that protectionism is efficient. So now you can argue one way or another whether it's good if you have a certain pie, how the pie should be adjusted, how the pie should be divided up on economic and ethical reasons. But if you have less to go around, then that's not ethical issue anymore. It's just an economic issue. You have less wealth to begin with. So these are the reasons why countries restrict industries. There are different kinds of arguments: protecting domestic jobs, protecting domestic national security. Very often, it's just special interest pleading and lobbying by the firms who want to be protected. Some of the technical arguments are like infant industry argument. So that means that, yes, we know that free trade is better, but we need to compete on an even playing field with others. Then we're going to protect our domestic industries who are young and not capable of competing on the world market for a while. And then once they're stronger, we're going to remove the restrictions. And that argument doesn't work very well because there is nothing as stable and unshakable as nothing as permanent as temporary government measures. So the American infant industry argument was used in 1790s for the first time by Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, who imposed the tariffs on steel and aluminum at that time. And there are still these steel and aluminum industries are apparently still young infant industries 203 years later on. Anti-dumping argument. That's very often. So what is dumping? Is selling goods in foreign countries at lower costs than the cost of production or below the price charged in domestic market. So now what is the argument behind this? So now I will direct you to the article that I posted, that many of these arguments are covered there. So dumping argument doesn't make much sense because eventually the only way in which the firms can afford to sell at lower prices is for a foreign country to subsidize artificially their domestic firms to sell at cheaper prices in the United States. So if a Japanese firm or a Chinese firm is selling below its costs in America, the only way that it can do so and stay in the business is that somebody else covers Japanese and Chinese taxpayer, in other words, covers the difference, covers the missing part of revenue. So that would mean then that dumping should be translated as Chinese and Japanese subsidizing American consumption. Chinese and Japanese governments taxing their own citizens to allow Americans to buy stuff at cheaper prices. Why is that bad for Americans? Foreign export subsidies arguments. So then this is connected to this. Some governments subsidize firms that export goods, and again, I cannot exactly see how is that bad for Americans. If Chinese and Japanese are stupid enough to tax their own people in order to increase American consumption, to create cheaper goods and services for Americans, it's difficult for me to see exactly why is that bad for American consumer. It could be bad for some of the American firms, but for American consumer, it's very good. And why what is good for individual American firms should take precedence over what is good for the American consumer. It's usually the other way around. Why would here be any difference? Why would things be any different here? Now, the low foreign wages arguments. So then our producers can compete with foreigners who have low wages. So this argument is false simply because wages are not the only factor that influence the productivity. There are many other factors that influence productivity, and the firms will determine whether they're going to produce something in a country A based on a variety of different factors, only one of which are low wages. And if we cannot compete with the foreigners in producing something, that means simply that they can produce it at lower opportunity cost. So then it's better for them. It's better for us that they produce it because we would be buying it at cheaper prices than for us to pay higher wages to people to produce something and then to sell it to Americans at higher prices. So then again, is this tension between the interests of producers and consumers. If you assume that the consumer interest should be the driving force of our public policy, then the low foreign wage arguments doesn't make sense at all. Saving domestic jobs argument. This is a very bad argument because you will save some jobs in America temporarily by offering tariff protection to domestic industry, steel industry. But in the long run, you're not going to save the jobs for two reasons. The first reason is that, yes, you increase the employment in steel industry, for example, but then by making steel prices higher than they otherwise would have been, you're reducing employment in other industries. So yes, in steel industry it increases because the revenue is higher and profit rates are higher and people invest more in steel, but then automobile industry and tractor industry and high-rise construction will suffer because the key input component that they use, steel, is more expensive. So there will be then less jobs in these industries. So these jobs are not directly visible, directly observable, but the losses are nevertheless equally real. So I'll give you just one example that average American car costs between $1,000 and $1,500, depending on the type of the cars, between $1,000 and $2,000 more as a consequence of steel and aluminum tariffs. That means that the demand for American cars will decline as compared to the situation in which there would be no steel and aluminum tariffs, which means that the employment in American manufacturing and retail and other services that are necessary for a car will decline as compared to the situation without the tariffs. So see, indirect losses of jobs more than offset the direct gains in jobs in protected industries. And the second reason, an equally important, maybe even more important reason, is that industries that are supported by subsidies or tariffs tend to become less and less efficient over time. If you are protected against foreign competition, you have less incentives to innovate, less incentives to cut costs, less incentives to improve So that will make you less competitive in the long run. This will make you less competitive in the long run, and this will then, to the extent that you can keep charging higher prices, imagine that the government will always cover your costs by either subsidies or protecting you against foreign competition by increasing tariffs. Uh, Consumers will have a strong motivation to turn to other products, to substitute your product, to use other things, to use more wood and less steel in construction, to use more composite materials instead of aluminum in making airplanes and helicopters and so on, which is already happening. So some of the most sophisticated new commercial airplanes like Airbus 350 and Boeing 787 Dreamliner are made almost entirely of composite synthetical materials, not aluminum that used to be the main material used to make the airplanes. So they're shifting. If your price is consistently higher, then there will be a greater incentive for your customers, buyers, to seek out alternatives, substitutes. So that means that the demand, technically speaking, demand for your product will get more elastic, which means that the consumers will tend to turn to the substitutes much more in the long run. So longer the system of subsidies and tariffs is maintained, more likely it is that the customers will substitute away, that the customers will find something else to replace your product. So nothing is irreplaceable. Everything could be replaced at a certain price. So another reason, so then these jobs in the steel and aluminum industry will be lost in the long run because of its inability to maintain this semi-monopolistic position protected by tariffs in the view of the widespread substitution process that the customers will be shifting to other alternative products. Okay, so that's all I've got for today. Next time we will finish this semester with international finance. I will post soon some additional information about the final exam. The final exam, as I said, will be covering just the material from after the midterm, and I will list a few things that you will need to know from before the midterm separately. So the exam will be on an online exam, probably on the April 24th, approximately. So I will create an assignment soon with the final exam. It will be a combination of multiple choice questions and a few essay questions. Similar format as we had for the midterm, essentially. So I will give you the exact number of. I haven't decided yet how many questions, but there will be probably about 15 multiple or 20 multiple choice questions, or maybe 3 essay questions. And you will have one day, for example, April 24th, the same system, the same drill as for the midterm. I will open up the assignment in the morning, and you will have the entire day to finish it. Once you start doing it, you will have whatever 90 minutes to finish the exam, maybe 2 hours. We'll see. So in the meantime, please read or reread all the material from after the midterm, and post on Canvas or send me via email any questions that you might have. So maybe next week or over the weekend or Monday, when I accumulate enough of your questions for the final exam, I will record another video answering all questions that you might have for the final exam. So please don't hesitate to send your questions. This is the only way how I can gauge the level of your understanding and how I can help you in any way to prepare for the final exam in addition to these lectures. So please send me your questions or demands for clarification, and I will then record a necessary number of additional videos to try and explain and help you with all of these questions. So good luck, and I'll see you around, and stay healthy.